Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we're talking about how to have conversations with children at the dinner table. We're joined by Stephanie Meyers, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist and founder of Families Eating Well, a nutrition practice training parents to coach healthy eating habits in kids. She is also the author of End the Mealtime Meltdown. She is nutrition coordinator in the Zakim Center for Integrative Therapies and Healthy Living at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and a former instructor in the graduate nutrition department at Boston University. She presents seminars worldwide on mindful eating, family nutrition, and cancer survivorship. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We're really excited to speak with you, and I think parents will get a lot of value from your expertise.
Thank you so much, Kendall and Cassie. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Stephanie. Can you talk about what is table talk and what are some examples of old table talk?
Yes, table talk is a term I've coined in my book. And for parents, table talk is one of those things that when you hear it, you know it. It's a very familiar thing. What my definition of table talk is, it's the words we say to our kids about their eating. Usually when they're eating, but not always. So an example might be, you haven't even tried it. Or just take 2 more bites of broccoli, then you can have more pasta. Or if you don't like it, you can spit it out. There are lots of phrases, at least in my opinion, that are sort of just part of how we talk to kids about their eating, often while they're eating, that unfortunately undermine our best intentions and what we actually are trying to do is in terms of helping our kids eat well. So table talk is what we say to our kids about eating, and actually it's a novel leverage point for changing how things are going at your family table.
So we've definitely heard examples, like you mentioned, of table talk of, eat your vegetables or, just try it. Or if you don't like it, you can do something different. And so as we talk about table talk, can you explain your method, the table talk method, and how this can kind of help combat some of that sometimes problematic language or unknowingly problematic language?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kendall. I want to be really clear about one thing. For parents who are listening and caregivers who are listening, hearing us share examples of things, you maybe shouldn't say to kids while they eat, just want to name the fact that I'm a parent myself, and I've said every single one of the things in my book. So this is not for people to feel worse about parenting. That is the last thing I would ever want people to have. But also when you are a parent and it is a real struggle, which in my experience, many people face this challenge with their kids, the point of even talking about table talk, what you might be saying on a usual basis and how to change it, is just to help you have less stress as a parent. And also to help your kid sort of take their seat as an eater, develop a healthier relationship with food. So the point of this by no means is to make people feel, guilty or bad or ashamed of how it's been going with feeding their kids. I think a lot of parents already feel that way. And the idea behind the table talk method, which is the table talk method, is just a set of practical skills, right? It's mindful eating married up with conscious communication, and a simple thing that parents can change, which is right on the tip of their tongue.
That makes it sound so simple, which I think that makes it really accessible for a lot of parents who are looking for, a good intro into this. So how does table talk, traditional table talk, impact children? And what are some benefits that parents might see from having a better table talk?
Great question. And I think that we don't really know how table talk ultimately affects kids, right? My work really spans generations of people's lifetime. So what I hear from adults about telling me stories of, well, when I was a kid, I had to eat the vegetable soup, and how they felt about that. Who really knows if it's the words that their parents use that directly cause them to have that memory? But I can tell you this, in 10 years of researching and trying to better grasp how parents typically talk to kids, most of the things we say are not the kind of things that tend to inspire change. And I'm coming at that from the angle of being a nutritionist and a dietitian for 25 years now. The actual idea for my book came from me being a professor and training nutrition students how to talk with clients to help them create the behavior change they wanted. And then, so what I did was talk to clients about how to talk to dietitians about how to do that. And it occurred to me that the things I train my students never to say are exactly the kind of things that we often say to kids around eating. So like I mentioned before, like, how much cake did you eat? Or good job eating your veggies. Like, that's not stuff I would ever say to an adult client, but it's stuff that we say to kids. So to answer your question, I think that how does this affect kids? I think it certainly can make them feel more pressure to eat. You know, like if you take 2 more bites of chicken, you can have more pasta, or you liked it last time. Like, those kinds of things don't help kids feel less pressure at the table. In fact, a lot of the times they make kids dig in their heels as eaters. And that negotiation, that sort of like frustrating thing that happens between parents and kids, like we label as picky, and I'm using air quotes right now, that comes oftentimes from the things that we say. We don't honor our kids' direct experience as eaters.
I think it's really interesting to point out that we wouldn't say those things to an adult because they could be offensive or triggering. And our relationship with food is a lifelong journey. I mean, it's always on our mind and how we approach it. So I do think it's interesting that in certain situations when approaching children that the feeling of empathy is kind of missing. It's just like, well, just do this because I told you to do that. And as we're talking about some of the traditional ways that people have gone about, you know, encouraging their kids to eat, albeit not necessarily the most encouraging way, in your book, you talk about 8 different types of table talk. Could you talk about those so that people could kind of recognize maybe what they're falling into, an example of each?
Absolutely. So there's 8 types, and you know, these are sort of, as I was researching this over the years, these themes just started to emerge in my opinion. So the first type is called instructive table talk. That's where you're telling your kid what you want them to do. Like, try this, you might like it. Corrective table talk is when you're telling your kid what they're doing wrong. Like, enough mac and cheese, you need to eat some veggies. Praise table talk is when you're praising them. Good job eating all of your sandwich. And parents sometimes get confused right about now. They're like, well, why can't I give my kid praise if they're doing the thing I want them to do at the table? And we'll get into that in a little bit. But unfortunately, praise is not the most effective way to get your kid to develop the skill of eating well over a lifetime, right? It gets your kid to do what you want them to do in the moment. But that a series of eating your sandwich, you know, one-offs eating the sandwich is not what makes kids into lifelong, to have a healthy relationship with food lifelong. Conditional table talk is the if-then kind of talk. So if your room is clean, we can get ice cream. Or if you eat enough, you know, veggies, you can have dessert. If-then, and that unfortunately sets up a really dicey rubric of using food as reward and punishment over a lifetime. That's challenging there. Obligatory table talk is when you tell your child they must do it or try it or eat it. The most classic thing that parents are familiar with in the obligatory category of table talk is the try bite or the 1 bite rule, or you must at least try it. I talk in the book about how sometimes as parents we think that the try bite is helpful if we give our kids permission to dislike it, but that's really unfortunately just like kids feel really like that is not at all how they feel in that experience. Like, and kids will tell you that. You have to try it, you don't have to like it is really not a great way to help kids engage with new foods. Expectant table talk is when you tell your kid what they should feel. So you liked this last time, or it tastes just like the one you got, just like the other thing you like, or the crust is the best part. Like, you're telling your kid what they should feel, and that might not be their direct experience, right? You're taking them away from their own center as an eater. Appreciative table talk is when you thank them for trying, or you thank them for eating all their whatever, all their salmon. And again, this one people get confused with praise, but praise is different than appreciative table talk. Both of them have unintended consequences that aren't so favorable. And then the last category of table talk is the closed-ended questions. Those questions usually start with did, do, can, will, have, or are. Like, did you try the carrots? Do you want more pasta? Can you please just take a bite? Will you at least try 2 bites? When we start questions with the helping verbs, like I just mentioned, we tend to create a scenario where we're giving our kid only the yes or no option. And they're going to, if they don't want to eat what you're asking them to do, they're more likely going to choose the no option. So that one just shuts down the whole process. It's just sort of like a dead end for you helping your child navigate into new dimensions with food.
Those are also helpful because, a good half of them at least seem like positive on the surface, whereas they're creating other problems of their own moving forward. And in your book, you talk a lot about curiosity and connection. Can you talk about why those are two important things when it comes to, stopping this mealtime meltdown and creating healthy eating habits?
Totally, Cassie. And curiosity and connection seem kind of generic. In the book, I define them. When I say curiosity, I mean a genuine inquiry that leads to a question, preferably an open-ended question, which you can learn a lot about in the book. And connection means a partnership. Like, here's your kid dissatisfied with what's for dinner, and you're going to show with your language that you're on their side, instead of maybe having an agenda that they eat it, And so curiosity and connection are so important because that's where better table talk comes from. It's really about parents shifting their mindset to say, in this situation, with your kid freaking out about whatever, asparagus, how can you as the parent get curious and or demonstrate connection? And your words are the thing that you can use to establish that. And that's when the whole thing starts to soften. When things start to get a little bit easier, when you can use language like, it seems like there's trouble with the asparagus, or what would help it? I hate asparagus, rather than saying you didn't even try it yet, or you liked it last time, it's the same recipe, or any number of other things we might say. If you eat 2 bites of asparagus, then you can have dessert. Rather than all of that, you just simply say, what's the asparagus like for you? And then you listen. And following that, you might say, what would help it? New table talk is very simple. I call them sentence stems. Some people call them scripts. They're not really scripted. Like, my book might come off as prescriptive, but it's really meant to help open up in your life the words that feel authentic to you. You don't have to memorize your lines. You've got to stay in the moment with your kid as they're eating. And that's why curiosity and connection are so important, because it's not about, I have one mom, a client, who actually wrote on her hand the things she thought she should say to her kid at dinner. I'm like, okay, that's a perfectly fine place to start, but it's going to become, once you start to practice some new types of questions, you'll find that just by having the intention of being curious or connected with your kid in their moment of food displeasure, you won't have to try so hard to come up with the right words. They'll automatically start to flow from your tongue. You'll stop saying some of the things that might have been totally unexamined in the past, and you'll start finding your way to a really authentic, natural language that allows for you and your kid both to feel less fed up at the table.
I think with most of parenting, those two components, curiosity and connection, are so important because they just open the lines of communication to your child and make them feel like they have a voice. As a child who had issues with eating meat, I really had problems eating meat as a child, and most adults were very dismissive to me about it. So I can understand, even as an adult looking back, how having a few questions and follow-ups and things like that really creates kind of a dialogue to figure out and I still don't eat meat as an adult. So it was like a long lasting, thing in my life. So, but I do want to talk about mindful eating as another component of your book. Why is it important for kids? I know we talk about it a lot for adults, but why is it so important to teach kids that mindful eating aspect? And what can we all learn from that?
So great that you asked, Kendall. So mindful eating is basically, I'm going to give a super basic definition here. It's bringing your sensory awareness to your experience of eating. That's the basic, the beginning part of it. And by the way, kids, ironically, don't usually have to be taught to eat like this. This is how we're all born eating this way, and then we sort of unlearn it as we get older. So when I'm teaching this in workshops, I ask people to put their hands up to their eyebrow line, and everyone feels a little silly. And then I say, but if touch your hands to your eyebrows, and then I want you to take a moment and say, if you have pineapple in front of you, what do your eyes notice with the pineapple? What does your nose notice with the pineapple? What does your mouth notice at the pineapple? Your hands, your throat, your stomach, etc. Everything that matters about how we eat happens below the eyebrow line. Whether or not your kid likes pineapple or eats enough pineapple or enough fruit or whatever is something that happens up here. And I'm pointing to my brain. That's the thinking mind. So when I teach about mindful eating as it relates to the table talk method, our goal as parents is to let go of the thinking mind around how our kids eating, what they're eating, enough of, too much of, etc., and to drop below the eyebrow line to where the sensory experiences of food are happening. And that's where the magic starts to happen. If you find yourself looking at your kid's plate and they're not eating enough of their protein or whatever it is, quite quickly, and I say this as a parent who has lived it themselves, right? God, I don't know how to get them to eat more vegetables. They're really not getting enough vegetables. That's a thought. If my kid's not eating enough vegetables and there's vegetables on the table, a better thing for me to do as a parent, rather than ask them to try a bite, is to ask them about what they notice about beans or broccoli or beets or tell me about the broccoli for you. What do you notice about broccoli? These are two examples of new table talk that will help you to get out of the thinking mind and into the direct experience, not only of mindful eating, but of helping your child believe that their direct experiences of food matter.
I have a feeling I know where you're going to land on this, but I have a follow-up question about, the not enough protein, the not enough vegetables. I feel like, I know this happened. I'm remembering specific times where my parents tricked my sister into eating something by telling her it was something they knew she liked, even though it was a different food. Like she was on a real ham kick. And so every meat they made, it was ham. How do you feel about the either secretly incorporating vegetables or sort of fibbing to get your kid to eat? Like, what does that do for this table talk situation when you're just totally avoiding it?
I love it, Cassie. I love that you also have a prediction of how I'm going to land on this. So I am not in favor of hiding, sneaking, and disguising food, and here's why. When a parent comes to me in my private practice and they've been doing this all along, they're like, listen, Johnny doesn't eat any vegetables, so we've had to puree them and hide them in everything that he eats. So he still gets them. Don't worry. But I say, okay, don't feel bad or guilty about that, but we are going to work on changing that. And here's why. What is your exit strategy? How do you plan to help Johnny come to the realization that, in fact, he does like broccoli and kale and green beans and cauliflower because he's been eating them all along in a disguised way? Unfortunately, all the cookbooks out there that teach parents to sneak, hide, and disguise don't help kids eat better. They just meet parents' thoughts about hoping that the kid's getting enough vitamins, minerals, nutrients, etc. Right? And so again, I'm not saying parents should never put broccoli in whatever meatballs, okay? But if you're doing that now and you're kind of like thinking with trepidation, oh man, I shouldn't be doing that, don't worry. It's not that you can't do that. Just don't hide it. When you bring those meatballs to the table, just use new table talk. Say, there's a surprise ingredient in the meatballs. Can you guess what it is? You're not like trying to dupe your kids into eating better, because that never works. Your kids, it's fascinating to me how quickly kids can get their own food, right? It does. Kids younger and younger, like, if you want your kid to like broccoli, the best way to do that is not to sneak that into their life and make them find out later that, oops, lo and behold, they always liked it. Yeah.
Well, that kind of goes along with earlier what we were talking about establishing a connection. You almost feel as a kid like you've been, like the bond has been broken. Like you've lied to me. Now there's another barrier of distrust there. So I totally get that too.
Yeah. And you're right, Kendall. Earlier I didn't really answer that question about what are the benefits for kids in terms of new table talk. One of the benefits is it strengthens relational bonds between caregivers and kids, right? Not only do kids eat better, they expand their palate without being pressured. They learn to practice skills of healthy eating. They have less tension and less resistance around food, but the bond over food, which think of like that's sort of the quintessential family dinner, right? Which for a lot of people doesn't feel that way. I just want to name that as well. But if that's what you're going for, if one of your goals as a parent is to really think about how do I help my kid develop a healthy relationship with food, your words as a parent are an excellent way to help that, to nurture that relationship.
Yeah, and not duping them doesn't insult their intelligence, right? And I think in your book, you talk about gastronomic intelligence. Can you talk about what that is?
Yes, of course. Gastronomic intelligence sounds like a really big word. Here's the thing, it's just the inner compass we all consult as eaters. It seems like a really lofty concept, and it's hard for when people first hear it, they're like, oh my gosh, I feel overwhelmed with, I have to change everything I say. And now we're talking about this thing, gastronomic intelligence. Every human already has gastronomic intelligence. It's just the inner touch point, the part of you that knows that you're okay as an eater. The fact that you don't like olives, how they feel in your mouth and your tongue. Like, the three components of gastronomic intelligence are satisfaction. So you know satisfaction when you experience it as an eater. No one needs to tell you that. Self-trust, that's your ability to make a decision about what you want, how much you want. That's a really important thing for kids to be able to build. And the third thing is self-compassion as an eater. That means being friendly toward yourself with food. And I could say a lot more about that, but I'll just leave it at this. Kids at younger and younger ages are starting to absorb diet culture and get a sense of like, I shouldn't eat that. Or I had a client last week, her daughter was 6 and she said, I know I eat too much sugar. It's like a 6-year-old saying that means that already we're not being a friend to ourselves as an eater. Like, we're already starting down that path. And how does that connect? The child experience of gastronomic intelligence is really the purpose of changing your table talk. You aren't changing your words to make your kids eat something. You're changing your words to help your child strengthen their gastronomic intelligence. That's where you grow and develop as an eater.
Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting-edge, evidence-based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strassel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com.
Stephanie, I wonder, when you're working with parents, do you find that they are struggling to unlearn their own relationship with food, and how does that play into them wanting better for their kids?
Yes, Cassie, not all the time, but I would say a significant percentage of the time. In fact, in chapter 10 of my book, I describe how a lot of the things we say to children, old table talk, if you will, show up as self-talk for adults later in life. If I could just get my act together with food, I'm such a bad eater. I want to eat healthy and I just can't seem to get it done. So this sort of unhelpful view that we have about ourselves as eaters, who knows where it starts? I'm definitely not suggesting that it's a parent's fault, that their kid grew up to have a message about their food and eating that was unhelpful. But as a parent, I would like to do all the things in my power to help my child grow up and have a view that they are okay as an eater, that they are worthy, that they are deserving, that they don't have to try to change their body, their food preferences. Those are things about them that are not faulty. So yeah, I do think there's as I work with parents, a beautiful thing about parents working to overturn their table talk is when I get an email from them and they say, wow, I'm starting to hear how I talk to myself about food. My inner dialogue is shifting because of my conscious and intentional effort to speak to my child differently about food. That's gives me goosebumps moments, because that's how all of us want to feel about food. There's nothing wrong with us. We're not doing a terrible job of this. Is literally comes down, without sounding grandiose, it comes down to, as parents, teaching our child how to care for themselves with food. That's what we're doing. And we want the best language for that as possible.
I really resonate with going back to gastronomic intelligence, the three components, and how reminding us how personal, deeply personal our relationship with food is. Like our own gauge of whether we like something or whether it brings us comfort or pleasure, and what we don't like, and that internal gauge. I think sometimes we can really get far away from that when we're not eating mindfully and checking in with ourselves. But I found that really interesting because I think sometimes myself, I forget just how personal that journey is, whether it's positive or negative. It's just really personal to yourself. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper as we talk about children and their relationship with food. I know you and I have talked about this, but as we're looking at children who have like really deep negative associations with food, or won't try things, or are just very limited in their exposure with different types of foods, is there any sort of like constant that you're seeing as an underlying issue? Is it anxiety in kids, or is there some sort of through line that kind of contributes to them showing that through food or their associations with food?
Yeah, I think it can be so, as you said, Kendall, personal. So I think I've seen a wide variety of things. And the stories from my clients, like I mentioned before, in adulthood, it's really quite spans the gamut in terms of, but I do think that anxiety, and we've talked a little bit about this. One thing I know for sure, at least in my experience, what I've observed is that anxiety wants certainty. Anxiety demands certainty, right? So if you're a kid and you're feeling anxious around food, or maybe you're feeling pressured around food and it's causing you to feel more anxious, like that's kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? The thing that's the same every time is like, the tube of squeezed yogurt, or the small frozen bagel, or the cracker. Like, parents often come to me and say, okay, listen, my kid will only eat 10 foods and they're all tan. And I'm like, okay, well, did those 10 tan foods come in a package that's predictable? It's reliable. It doesn't vary. It's not, no, there's going to be no surprises there, right? So if we think about anxiety and how it might connect to a kid's experience as an eater, it makes sense to me that a kid who's feeling particularly anxious about food wants to stick to the tried and true. Like, branching out, there's not a lot of certainty in that. Being asked to lick something or eat something, even if you're given permission not to like it, that doesn't make you feel less anxious. That actually amps up, at least for me. So in my workshops with parents, I start by asking them to think of a food they hate. I'm like, think of a food you hate. We're not talking about the kids, just you. What do you hate? Like, literally, if I put a plate of it in front of you right now, you'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't be near the smell of this. I can't be looking at it. Everything below the eyebrow line is starting to feel like you're revolted by the food. And then imagine I sit down next to you and I say to you, you haven't even tried it. Just try a little. If you don't like it, you can spit it out. You need to at least try it before you say you don't like it. And then I ask, the parents are kind of shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and I say, how true does that experience feel for you? So for many people, the feeling of being anxious, if we want to call it that, or the parent's perception that their child is rigid as an eater, those things, if a kid is feeling that way, they're more likely to get more narrow. So which started first? It's hard to say. But I can tell you this, if you can try, even for parents for whom they feel like their child is really narrow in their palate, trying just a very few things, new table talk, like, what's happening for you with the oatmeal? You can fill in the blank with whatever the food is. Saying that to your kid, what's happening for you with the oatmeal? What do your eyes notice about the oatmeal? What's your nose notice about the oatmeal? And what would make it better? And the kids, when you ask them, what do you notice about oatmeal? They say, it's gross. And when they say that, your options are to say, which part, or what would help it? I had a story last week of a parent whose child hated oatmeal, and they asked you table talk questions. And it's so fascinating. The child had a super narrow palate, literally preferred to drink milk, like just drink milk rather than eat any food. And that was kind of the routine they'd gotten into, glass of milk, glass of milk, glass of milk. And the parents were like, what do we do? And I said, oh, we're trying to get her to eat oatmeal for breakfast instead of just drink milk. And I said, oh, here's your new table talk. Tell me about milk. What do you notice about milk? And the little girl was like, it's creamy and cold. Guess what? All you have to do then is say, because you're curious and connected, how could we get some of what you love about milk, cold and creamy, to oatmeal? Suddenly the child has ideas of how you can get cold and creamy going with oatmeal. That's a solution that's based out of genuine curiosity and connection, rather than trying to get the kid to try it, like it, taste it, lick it, smell it, anything. Just asking the open-ended question is a huge change point for people.
So why are those open-ended questions so much more powerful?
Yes, open-ended questions you will learn a lot about in my book, and they are one of 3 things you can do as a parent to change family dynamics. And the reason open-ended questions work is that they take you as the parent out of the position of putting pressure on your kid, and they invite your kid into their direct experience of eating. So you're helping release the pressure valve that has been on sort of like a repeat reel. That's why open-ended questions work.
And I think we could all apply open-ended questions to many areas of our life and get better results. But yes, specifically in this instance as well, I think it's definitely proven effective, even just in our conversation talking about how much that can change a child's approach to something that they were a little apprehensive about. And as we're kind of going in this direction, one of the things I've noticed as we're talking about like the underlying effects of why a child might have a negative association with food, something I've heard along the line is that a lot of it comes down to the child feeling like they have a little bit of control in their life. Like, this is what I can control. This is what I like. Like, as a child, you don't have many things that you can control. And so segueing this a little bit into, children are often placed into a category of picky eaters, and I'm also using air quotes. And I wanted to talk about why that term can be problematic and what we can learn about how to talk about this topic without labeling children as picky or difficult, and kind of what your opinion is on the whole topic.
I love that you're asking, Kendall. So this is really important because that label picky there's no official definition, by the way. Pickiness is a subjective opinion of a parent. And I say this lovingly to all the parents out there. Remember, we're not here to like layer on the guilt. But picky eating, at least in my opinion, and I try not to use that term, even though it's in the title of my book, because it's the term that everyone uses to describe the thing we all know, which is these like irritating moments when we're trying to help our kids eat and they're feeling frustrated, we're feeling frustrated, and so on and so on. Picky eating is not a term I believe we should ascribe to children. If you're having an experience of what you would consider as a parent picky eating behavior, my belief is that pickiness comes out of the interpersonal dynamics at play around food, which is really good news because that's actually something you can change. You know, parents say to me, my kid's never going to eat more than these 8 foods. And I say, but let's be open to the fact that, in fact, that's probably not true. They probably are. And so rather than use the word picky, what if we use the word exploring? What if we change the language around how we talk to kids? Because again, this is pretty obvious when I say this, but I think that kids, especially kids who overhear their parents describing them as picky, they take that on. Like, I've had a lot of clients whose kids tell people, oh, I'm a picky eater. I don't have, I don't eat that. I'm a picky eater. They just like adopt the label. They've heard it said about them so many times that they've just, that they believe it themselves. They bought into it, and now they think that they're in that box. So I think, yes, letting go of the word and term picky eating, or picky eater, especially picky eater, that's the one that really gets like me uncomfortable.
I think that picky has such a negative connotation too, and I like the exploring one because it's very open. And I totally agree. I think I've heard that, when you're calling yourself a picky eater, you almost like dismiss yourself from trying new things as well. Like, it really can label you to yourself, and then you just sort of stick to those like safe foods.
Yeah, and I've seen Cassie adults who come to see me and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm really picky." And I, you know what I ask them? Where did you get that information? Like, how do you know that? Tell me about what does that mean for you to say you're picky? Because the thing is, for a lot of people, it's something that they just took on at some point in their life. Maybe they were told, maybe they weren't, but it causes them to not have trust in themselves. Remember, the second pillar of gastronomic intelligence is self-trust. And if you grow up hearing you're picky, or you just self-identify as picky, that sort of erodes the trust you have with your own self and food. Again, great news. That's something that you can work on. There's help for that. It's not a permanent, it's not a permanent and fixed way of being with food.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, labeling something when you were younger. Like, for example, when I was younger, I did not like spicy foods. Like, I didn't trust my own self to try something that wasn't too spicy. And now in my adult years, I'm letting myself explore that. And I realize I do actually really like, spicy food, and my palate has changed. But for so long, I was like, oh, I'll just get mild because I don't like spicy food versus trying, to see where I'm actually at with that now.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And how you just spoke so wonderfully to the fact that palates do change. I tell parents when they come to see me and their kid is 6, I say, I want you to imagine a kid 10 years from now. And then they take a second and they're like 16. Then imagine a kid 20 years from now. Like, they're not going to be eating Cheez-Its only. That's not going to happen. Do you know what I mean? And maybe it will, but also the bottom line here is that if your hope as a parent is that you can enable your child to have that sense of adventure, to do the thing you said you did, Cassie, which is like, let me just check in with myself right now. Do I need to just be ordering mild every time? Like, if that's what you want for your kid, if you sincerely believe they will never try any new food unless you make them, but somewhere in your brain you think to yourself, I would like my kid to be able to figure out what satisfies them. I think then it's worth trying a few new table talk lines to see if you can have your shoulders relax a little, feel like you're breathing easier at the table, and you're actually giving your kid a chance to, as you said, Kendall, take their seat as an eater. Feel like they're empowered, not just, having to eat whatever's put in front of them.
I do agree very much with, when you've been at a table with someone who self-identifies as a picky eater, though, and they just get it out of the way. I'm a picky eater, and you're like, oh, okay. And yeah, again, that's come from somewhere, and that they feel the need to just come out and say, oh, sorry to be in position here, but I don't eat certain things. It's also funny how our surroundings, or people in our surroundings, really tag us as a certain, you could say one day, like Cassie saying, she didn't think that she would like spicy food. Offhandedly, 10 years ago, I mentioned that I don't love onions. And over the years, I have gotten more comfortable with onions and sauteed. And every time we sit down for dinner, well, we'll put the onions on the side because Kendall doesn't like onions. And I have tried to, defend my position to go, no, I'm into it now. I've allowed myself to try them, but you kind of get labeled, and that's a funny one to undo. But I did have a question about, so kind of the whole conversation has revolved around instilling these healthy habits in children early, and being curious and having conversations about them. And I was wondering, in your experience, have you ever had parents or people who were in opposition to giving children so much of a voice in that experience, where they feel that by really letting them be a part of it, you're catering a little bit too much to them?
Okay, this is a fascinating question, Kendall. I love that you asked it, because a couple months ago, I was asked to give a lecture at a fairly prominent children's hospital, which shall remain nameless, to a group of psychologists. And one of the psychologists, I think only 60% of the people in the Zoom were parents themselves, but one psychologist raised her hand on the Zoom call to ask the question, if I let my kid have their thoughts and feelings and experiences of food be, such a part of how this goes, how will I ever teach them like what's healthy and unhealthy? And it was a remarkable question, because she went on to describe how she has a teenager who really wants to eat like junk food, who's eating like a fast food restaurant meal, like a pre-dinner dinner. And she's like, if I don't tell him explicitly that that's unhealthy, that that food is bad, how is he ever going to learn that? It was a fascinating conversation. We got to play it out in real time. And I said to her, what would happen if you just changed how you were approaching that? Instead of shaming, blaming, and telling him that he's, eating food that's, toxic and whatever. There was like a lot of strong language. So even doing away with all of that and just simply asking, like, what do you like? Tell me about Big Mac for you. What is it? Can we ask an open-ended question? And can we trust our child to experience satisfaction, self-trust, and self-compassion for themselves? And it was really fascinating how it's a big, we're flipping a switch here, right? This is turning what we think we need to do as parents around eating on its head. Like, imagining that your kid is eating stuff you don't want them to because you think it's going to damage their health. Telling them that explicitly over and over and over again is not going to make your kid like that food or want that food less. Your goal is to help them understand when they're having that food, whatever it may be, how do they know when they've had enough? How do they know when they're full? How do they know when they may or may not actually even like that food? Interesting way to think about it is that we are less responsible for making our children understand what healthy and unhealthy is. I'm using air quotes again. And we are more responsible for helping them get below their eyebrow line to honestly experience the satisfaction or lack thereof that they have themselves with food.
That's so interesting because I feel like the whole fast food example, a lot of kids are probably rebelling against, the healthy food that's been thrust upon them versus actually enjoying that food, right? Like, that's such an interesting flip to it.
Yeah,
to
and
just ask why.
the number one thing that matters to teens is the taste of food. So foods that have been specifically engineered to taste and light you up with all the taste feelings, right? You're gonna, as a parent, if you're gonna just keep trying to badger the health angle, you're probably not going to make a lot of progress. And so your really good table talk to ask a child in that instance is, what's the flavor of XYZ food for you? What's the flavor for you? Because
Yeah.
that's what kids care about, right? Flavor is an experience that they're having that they might be able to say something about. And then parents will say, well, can I just give a little bit of my own input? I'm like, sure. And the way you do that, there's specific table talk for that too. You say, for me, that food, it's got a really strong aroma. The first 3 bites feel incredible. And then somewhere around there, I sort of my taste buds get a little saturated, whatever you actually feel. You don't have to make this up. But if you want to offer your input, do it after you've asked your kid an open-ended question. Make an open-ended question sandwich. Say, what's the flavor of a Big Mac for you? Listen to what they say. I haven't had one for a while, but for me, last time I had one, it was like this in my mouth. It smelled like this. And then after 3 bites, I was kind of done. What about for you? You're starting with an open-ended question and you're ending with an open-ended question. That's the way you can help your child arrive at their own understanding of what meets their needs, what's quote healthy and quote unhealthy for them.
All back to connection and curiosity, right?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. Yes, Kathy, you got it.
Stephanie, what are some of the big takeaways that you hope parents will take from your book and this method?
The biggest takeaway I hope parents have is this. Everyday eating encounters with kids are challenging, no matter what age your children are. But there's something you can do that you may have never even thought to try before, and that is to use better words to help point to the wordless, to help your kid feel the sense of worth and belonging that I think everyone wants and deserves with food. That's the biggest takeaway.
Oh, I think that's a great place to end on, Stephanie. And I have really appreciated our conversation today and learning more about open-ended communication really being the important foundation in establishing better table talk and all the different methods that we and parents can use to establish those connections with their children.
Thank you so much, Kendall and Cassie. It was so fun chatting with you. I loved your personal experiences because I think all of us all of us as eaters have a window into what it feels like to be in our own body eating. So keeping that curiosity and connection, even for people who aren't parenting, right? I think this conversation goes beyond just parents, grandparents, caregivers, teachers, coaches, people who have influence over an eater's life. Everyone can think a little bit about how table talk could help them nurture that kind of relationship in kids that they care for.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Written by a dietitian and mindful eating expert, End the Mealtime Meltdown serves up the familiar yet largely unexamined phrases parents say to kids at mealtime and shows what you say to your kids can actually sabotage your efforts to instill healthy habits. With this practical guide, you'll discover the communication skills you need to end conflict at the dinner table for good. In the book, you'll find specific guidance on what not to say to kids as they eat, acknowledgement that conflict at the dinner table is a normal part of parenting, specific words, scripts, and detailed instruction on how to encourage conversation that positively impacts eating behavior and development, real-life stories showing how the table talk method can ease parent distress, instructions on how to tailor this approach to fit your individual needs, and tools to help kids develop a healthy relationship with body and food that will last a lifetime. If you're craving better ways to deal with turmoil during meals and instill a healthy curiosity about food in your family, this go-to guide is your lifeline. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
Help your clients achieve lasting emotional balance with the DBT Skills Mega Bundle from New Harbinger Publications. This essential collection offers everything you need to effectively deliver dialectical behavior therapy in your practice, including a set of 8 exclusive microskills videos to help improve client motivation and treatment. Visit newharbinger.com for more information.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.